Hello, welcome to the Conference on Labor in the 21st Century. I'm Alex Colvin, Dean of Cornell University's ILR School, which is hosting this conference. I want to begin by taking a moment to acknowledge and recognize the Cayuga Nation, whose ancestral homelands Cornell University is located upon. I also want to extend my thanks and appreciation to the faculty and staff of ILR's Worker Institute for their hard work in organizing this conference today. I think we've got an excellent lineup of events for the conference. I also particularly want to recognize ILR's tech staff, without whose hard work this would not be possible. We've all come to appreciate their work so much this year during these difficult times. This is part of ILR's 75th anniversary events. Our school was founded in 1945 with the purpose of improving labor relations through our research, education, and outreach efforts. And we continue to hold true to that mission today. It's also a product of our Lois Gray initiative, and we draw inspiration from our dear departed colleague and friend who was at the center of our labor outreach efforts throughout almost the entire history of our school. Those efforts continue both with the breadth and depth of our faculty research on labor issues and with our important labor education programs, ranging from our Yulia and Neely programs to our new work with the AFT and our programs addressing important new issues like labor and climate change. Today, as we consider the challenges facing labor in the 21st century, we see challenges, including issues of inequality and racial injustice in our society, the declining reach of union representation, globalization, technological change, the rights of gig workers. But we also are in a time where the possibility of change is in the wind. We see the successes of the Fight for 15 campaign, the Red for Ed strikes, new possibilities now in labor policy, a changed political climate, and workers raising their voices. And yes, maybe even the chance to win a bargaining unit at Amazon in the heart of Alabama. Today, we have a genuinely exciting and terrific lineup of speakers from a range of different perspectives that I think we're all going to be very excited to hear discussing important issues. Next, though, I'm going to turn over to my colleague, Esther Bigler, who is the Director of ILR Outreach's Labor and Employment Law Programs and also Director of New York City Government Relations for us and has long been at the heart of our labor-related work. Esther, over to you.
Thank you, Alex. Professor Emerita Lois Gray was my friend. She was my colleague and a mentor to me and many others. She was a beloved member of the ILR faculty who committed her life to advancing social justice and worker rights. She believed in using education as a tool for workers and labor leaders to learn, experiment, create a fair and equitable, diverse workforce. She died on September 20th, 2018 in New York City, only a few weeks before her 95th birthday. When I think of my friend Lois, three words come to mind. Lois was strong. She was an institutionalist and an innovator. She believed that both the ILR school and the labor movement had to continually reinvent themselves to remain relevant as the world of work changes, so both institutions are able to meet our mission of helping to create a just workplace. Her work as a labor educator and scholar was dominated by this commitment to workers and to the issues of women and minorities that they face as workers and members of their unions. She was committed to diversity before anyone was using this word we hear so often today. Lois joined the ILR school faculty in 1947 and created the first extension office in Buffalo, New York. She moved to New York in 1956 to direct the Metropolitan District Office, and she became our Associate Dean and Director of Extension in 76, where she directed off-campus programs providing educational services which enrolled tens and thousands of students in all parts of the workplace. She was one of the founders of the field of labor education and continued to be both a scholar and a labor educator throughout her career. During her tenure at ILR, Lois was an innovator. Under her leadership, examples of new labor education programs were instituted. The Latino Leadership Program to train minorities to become trade union leaders. Leadership training for women, the Trade Union Women's Studies Program to give women the tools to raise their voices in their unions. Credit and certificate programs in labor studies, that was really at the forefront. And that program continues now online and reaches an international audience. Research and education on occupational safety and health, which led to the founding of COSH groups, the Northeast Regional Summer School, which she faithfully attended. Lois continued doing research and publishing throughout her career. She was the recipient of many honors and awards. Two that meant a great deal to her was the Lifetime Achievement Awards from the Labor and Employment Relations Association and the United Association for Labor Education. Lois lived her values until the end of her life. I can attest that Lois was thinking about the labor movement in the last days of her life, setting up the Lois Gray Innovation Fund, which brings this conference today. Lois was in NYU Hospital. She was dying. She had told me weeks before that she wanted to change her will. She was setting up an innovation fund, but it wasn't exactly what she wanted. She hadn't gotten a chance to call her lawyer, which was also my lawyer. So she calls me next to her bed and she says, Esther, we have to change my will now before I die. I said, okay, Lois, let me see if I can find the lawyer. It was a weekend. I couldn't find him. So I called up a friend, a fellow ILRI, and I said, I need you to write a codicil to Lois's will. My friend said, codicil? I didn't take trust in estates in law school. I don't know how to do that. I said, you went to Yale Law School? Google it, and let's do it. My friend Googled it. She brought the codicil to Lois. Lois edited it. She changed the words to make sure that it really was going to set up the innovation fund the way she wanted, to really work with the labor movement and the ILR school together. So with this conference, we hope to carry forward Lois's spirit by providing the spark for all of you to think innovatively about the challenges and opportunities for the labor movement in the 21st century. We will be showing a short video about Lois during the breaks in the conference. I hope you will see it. And now it is my pleasure to introduce my colleague and friend, Patricia Campos Medina, the Executive Director of the Worker Institute, an ILR grad who has worked both with SEIU and Unite Here, and is a national leader for immigrant rights. Patricia?
Thank you so much, Esther, for that introduction. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I am Dr. Patricia Campos Medina, and I serve as the Executive Director of the Worker Institute. Today, as a society, we are fighting a pandemic that has disrupted our everyday lives. This pandemic has revealed the failure of our current economic model to secure the welfare of all workers, and the massive failure of our current labor laws to protect our essential frontline workers. But most of all, it has revealed the deep economic divide in our country and the fact that the majority of American families today are living on the verge of economic disaster. It has also revealed that this economic divide meant that working class Americans, African Americans, Latino, and immigrant workers are bearing the brunt of the impact of the pandemic. They are dying at greater rates due to the lack of healthcare and because they are the essential workforce keeping middle-class Americans safe. As academics, social justice leaders, and labor leaders, we must come together and recommit to the work of building an economy that invests in the potential of the American worker on Main Street and defend our democratic system of government so that workers have the tools to exercise their rights at work. And how do we do that? We must embrace the call for racial and economic justice demanded by the uprising of our Black youth against racial and economic oppression. We must embrace the call for a new model of labor relations that gives power to workers to join together into unions and balance the scales of power against mega corporations like Amazon. That seems like a big task, but like Nelson Mandela said, everything is impossible until it's not. As an immigrant woman, a political refugee from the wars of Central America, I always look for guidance from Monsignor Romero, the spiritual leader of the working class in El Salvador. During those years of war, he spoke about how leaders must take advantage of moments in society where a moment of kairos happens, a moment of change. I believe that today is the moment of change that demands that we come together and balance the scales of power. We must be bold and courageous and imagine a new future where collective bargaining rights, the rights to organize a union, and the right to be treated with human dignity of people of color and of immigrant, independently of their immigration status, is respected by employers and enforced by our government. In this spirit of chaos that we find ourselves today, the Worker Institute welcomes all the leaders to this conference today. Lois Gray was an innovator who believed in the power of workers to come together and change our workplace and our society. It is based on that commitment that we at the Worker Institute will continue to collaborate with all the leaders in the labor and social justice world to advance the rights of workers to have collective bargaining and achieve economic opportunity and racial justice in our workplaces. We are a place of policy, research, innovation. We seek evidence-based solutions to the problems of workers in the workplace. As you listen to leaders today, I encourage all of us to heed the words of another great American spiritual leader, Dr. Reverend William Barber II, who reminds us all every day with his Poor People's Campaign that is our responsibility as leaders of the labor movement, as leaders of the social justice movement, as leaders in our everyday lives, to call the question on the rising economic inequality and the growing threat of our democracy. In this moment, he says, we must embolden our resistance and we must demand change. I am excited to welcome you to this conference and to this debate and this conversation, and we hope to have solutions and we hope to have the courage to implement them. Thank you for joining us. And now our first panelist will be introduced by Tammy King. Tammy.
Thank you so much for those inspiring comments, Patricia. Good morning, everyone. My name is Tammy Kim, and I'm a freelance reporter and a fellow at Cornell's ILR Worker Institute. It's my honor to moderate the opening plenary session today with Rebecca Dixon, Mary Kay Henry, and Analilia Mejia, who will share their wisdom on the themes of the Lois Gray Conference, the elements of a worker-centered recovery, the opportunities of a new legal and regulatory environment, and the evolving relationship between labor and politics. Before I introduce the panelists, just a few logistical notes for the audience. The format of this session will be conversational, an extended question and answer. If you'd like to submit a question, please do so by clicking on the icon in the upper right corner of your video window. For people who may be deaf or hard of hearing, or would like to read closed captioning, you can turn on that function at the bottom of your screen. And please note that this session is being recorded. Now I'll take a moment to introduce our esteemed panelists. Rebecca Dixon is an attorney and the executive director of the National Employment Law Project, a leading nonprofit that has shaped state, local, and national campaigns on misclassification, unemployment insurance, and the minimum wage, among other policies. As a native of Mississippi, Rebecca brings a deep analysis of race, class, and gender to her work on labor issues. Mary Kay Henry is the international president of the Service Employees International Union, the first woman in that position. She's an architect of critical organizing strategies in the healthcare sector, including non-traditional bargaining agreements and card check agreements, and has led SEIU through the development of the Fight for 15 and a Union campaign. Analilia Mejia is the recently appointed Deputy Director of the Women's Bureau of the United States Department of Labor, which develops standards and policies to promote the equity and economic security of working women. Analilia previously worked on the presidential campaign of Bernie Sanders and as the head of the Working Families Party in New Jersey. We're so grateful for your time, Rebecca, Mary Kay, and Analilia. Thank you so much for joining us. I'd like to begin with a couple questions for all of you on the current state of our street politics. Last summer, many of us were on the streets to protest alongside essential workers and immigrant workers and to show support for Black Lives Matter. The mood, due to the winter and other factors, is much quieter now, but inspiring campaigns like the Amazon Warehouse, Organizing, and Bessemer are still brewing. What do you each make of the last year of protests? And what is your forecast for working class mobilization in 2021? Rebecca, let me start with you, please.
Sure, Tammy. I think that one of the things to recognize is two things. The way folks stepped into their power this summer and really kind of got to the place where they weren't going to take it anymore. And the second thing is the multiracial nature of this, which seems like an awakening to the interconnectedness that we all have. So even if folks are not of color, joining together with the mobilization is really important. I think these movements have multiple channels. So just because we don't see folks in the street doesn't mean that there's not a lot still going on. So I think, these folks are doing power mapping, and they're understanding where the levers of power are, not just on the federal level, but also on state and local level. And there's a lot of really wonderful work going on.
Thank you for that. Mary Kay, how about you?
I agree with Rebecca, and I'm thrilled to be with Rebecca and Analilia on this panel, Tammy. And may Ruth memory be a blessing to us all. It was so inspiring to hear the opening here. Thank you. I agree that from my perspective, things have not quieted down. It may not be as visible in the streets, but our union has experienced more interest from non-union workers across the service sector than at any time, at least in my 40 years of organizing inside of SEIU, and for people that have done it longer. There is both the racial reckoning that a multiracial group of workers are interested in fueling, but also the crush of the public health, economic, and climate crises together with a racial reckoning has created a condition where we see nursing home workers walking off the job if they can't get the health and safety protections they need, and demanding a union and getting recognized within 3 days by an employer. That's happened 3 times in the state of Pennsylvania. I wish and dream someday that it could happen in every nursing home in the country, given what nursing home workers have faced. We heard about the Amazon workers organizing. I always imagine when you think about the warehouse workers that have walked off the job in the last year, what more could we each do that would fuel those workers being able to know they were supported by an organization? We have fast food workers that have struck in 300 sites over multiple days in the last 4 months. Just yesterday, we had home care and nursing home workers making a demand on the administration about high investments in caregiving jobs, in addition to green infrastructure jobs in the next actions of Congress. So I have to tell you, my experience is that things have not quieted down. They may have shifted off of the streets, and that this is in the moment of the greatest challenge and crisis for working people. I think we're going to see the most incredible opportunity to build permanent organization and workers' power in this economy.
Thank you, Mary Kay. What about you, Analilia?
So I concur. It's taken a different shape, but it's still that activism and the fire that we felt last summer is still felt. I will say, I would be remiss to not say that my path to the Women's Bureau was actually paved by the lessons and the organizing skills that I picked up at Unite Here, thanks to my sister Patricia, and the skills that I was able to sharpen while being blessed to have worked under the leadership of Mary Kay at the Property Services Division, and then ultimately at 32BJ. So I need to say, labor strong always, all day long. So, from my vantage point, I had the benefit of working through, or the opportunity, better yet, to work through the transition process for the current administration, and now working within the Department of Labor. And in both places, I actually had the opportunity to see the movement engage in policy identification and policy making and advocacy through that process. So folks who were involved in the Black Lives Matter movement, in the care economy, in all of the different ways in which we saw activism on the street, very smartly engaged in the policymaking, the government building process of the transition, as well as are currently engaging within different levels of government to make sure that we codify the policy ideas that workers, that families, that Americans need. And so, yeah, it may not be as visible as we saw it in the summer, but I can tell you from my vantage point, it is live and strong, and folks are working really hard to really bring the level of change that we know American workers, American families, that all of our communities actually deserve and need.
Thank you all for those insights. Just to drill down on that a bit more, an early achievement of the Biden administration is obviously the recent passage of the American Rescue Plan, which, from I think a lot of people's vantage points, includes landmark provisions to address poverty, health inequities, and the concerns of the working poor, which preceded the pandemic. What do you all see as the highlights and defects of the bill? And is there any hope of extending its terms beyond next year? Mary Kay, let's start with you, please.
Well, a big highlight is targeted access for communities of color to the vaccine. And I was in a parking lot at a unified school district in Sacramento 2 Thursdays ago, where janitors and security officers were getting access in the second queue behind healthcare workers and teachers. And the union was allowed to help with the registration and education of workers, so that undocumented workers who either walked in because they took the bus or drove in didn't turn away when they saw the government seals and weren't sure if ICE was lurking behind a corner. And so I just have to say that that's been a huge plus. And during the 15-minute wait period, when people were getting their vaccines, primarily brown undocumented workers from Mexico and Latin America, and primarily Black security officers, some of whom were African immigrants, we did an education on additional benefits that people are eligible for under the ARP, which is the extended and enhanced subsidies to the Affordable Care Act, so that workers may have access to health care for the first time that would be regular, and education about the child care tax credit or the unemployment that family members may have access to. I don't want to, those are the highlights of what I heard as having the most impact on those members of SEIU that we're also trying to advocate for in every community in America, for both union and non-union working people to get access to these enhanced benefits.
Thank you for that. Analilia?
So I think it's clear that the pandemic really exposed holes in the nation's safety net and had devastating consequences for individuals and communities. And the intention of the ARP is to improve those holes, and therefore improve the lives of people, working people and their families. I mean, the reality is that, through the pandemic, what we saw was that 4.7 million women found themselves either pushed out or had to walk away from the labor market. We know that you have 24 million adults who are reporting that their household sometimes or often doesn't have enough food to eat. These are households that include up to 11 million children. We know that Black and Latino households were disproportionately impacted, many reporting that they're 3 times as likely to report, in fact, that they don't have food to eat. So in all of these ways, American people were suffering, and it had a disproportionate impact on Black, brown, working class people. And so what does the ARP try to do? It tries to address as much as possible, like just creating a little bit of economic stability for these families. Now, we know that more has to happen. The president has laid out that he has plans, future goals of working on a large jobs and infrastructure bill. We'll have to work hard to make sure that the benefits of that bill are targeted so that they increase opportunities for women, they expand opportunities in non-traditional roles, and that when we think about infrastructure, that we're not just thinking about buildings and roads, but also care infrastructure, right, which predominantly is worked by women. So I think there are many benefits that the ARP, I could enumerate, but let's not, folks, we could obviously share with folks who are watching. But the bottom line is that the intention was to create a little bit of economic stability for American families. And there is this was a long impact, and therefore the recovery will require just as much time, if not more.
And Rebecca, from your perspective at NELP, the upsides, downsides, and possibilities of extending the terms of the ARP?
I think to start with the downsides, the Raise the Wage Act for the $15 minimum wage was not included, and that was very disappointing. But to talk about the positive, there was financial relief included in this legislation. Families were suffering. Millions of families entered the new year behind on rent, utilities, facing eviction. And so the stimulus payments were important. And also the tax credits were targeted directly at child poverty, which is important. And one of the issues that is near and dear to NELP's heart that we work on is support for unemployed workers. And it's important to note that when the benefits lapsed in December, so Congress wasn't able to extend them in time, it shortchanged jobless workers of approximately $17.6 billion in benefits for the first 4 weeks of January. And this is at the time when 72% of unemployed workers said they were having a hard time meeting basic needs in their household. And so it's really important that this didn't lapse and that there was an extension to September. Unfortunately, the extension to September kind of is setting us up for a lapse because the Congress won't be in session when the benefits expire. So it'll be important for them to get ahead of that deadline and extend that relief. So I would just say that the financial relief in this bill is notable, given that we're often pivoting to austerity at times like this.
Thank you for that. I wanted to turn to each of you now individually. Analilia, I was curious if you could tell us a little bit more about your new post in DOL and the work of the Women's Bureau. As you mentioned, you have a long career that spanned work in unions and different in politics in various forms. Why did you decide to work for the Biden administration? And what do you hope to accomplish in the Department of Labor with regard to sectors that are predominated by women? Oh, and hello.
And I'm, of course, facing what many women face, which is working from home with a small child and childcare responsibilities. So the Women's Bureau is one of the few agencies. I am so sorry. The Women's Bureau is one of the few agencies in U.S. government that's tasked with really focusing on the needs of working women. And so we've been really focused on making sure that we are directing our research. Directing our research so that it addresses and uncovers the way American women are experiencing the workplace. We also are really focused on making sure that we are looking at alternative. Mommy is wrong. We are focused on making sure that we are looking at opportunities for expanding non-traditional roles for women. So for example, through apprenticeship programs, non-traditional roles, are women really getting the opportunities they need to expand into career choices that are actually higher earning and give them greater economic stability? We know that when women have choices, they make choices that are positive for their families. And so at the Women's Bureau, our intention is, how do we expand those opportunities? How do we use research to really shine a light on what's happening for women workers. How do we use our grant making ability in order to really take what works and scale it up? The reality is that this pandemic has, as I said, it's uncovered all of the gaps, different gaps in our economy for working women. We have to balance children, as you just saw, maybe elder care that squeezes us on both sides, and then trying to navigate workplaces that aren't as flexible as we need them to be. So I'm very proud to have the opportunity to work in this space to help shine a light on the needs of working women and to bring my own background as a working class person, as a first generation immigrant, as a union organizer, someone that worked with low wage workers in maintenance, in hotel industries, in textile, and bring all of that in order to enrich like what we're actually doing for all workers. So.
Thank you for that. Rebecca, you briefly mentioned unemployment insurance, and I know that you're an expert in this area in your own right as an attorney. Obviously, UI has become a huge part of the safety net over the last year, even more perhaps than after the Great Recession. And in unemployment and other areas of the work, you also mentioned the minimum wage, for instance, that I know NELP has done a lot of work on. What legal reforms do you see as possible in the coming months and years of the Biden administration?
Sure. So I think it's important to say that a lot of the challenges workers are facing now in the pandemic, they've been facing for a long time. So it's not new. And I think it gives us an opportunity to shine a light on how segregated opportunity is in the United States. And when I say that, I mean that, Black and brown workers are concentrated in underpaid, dangerous jobs. And we're seeing that with their frontline worker status. But most people don't know that nearly 9 out of 10 jobs in the US and occupations are segregated by race. And that is not accidental. That's intentional based on the policy choices we've made across time at the state, local, and federal level. So I think the policies that need to be focused on by the administration are things that go to the heart of this labor market inequity. So raising the minimum wage is crucial. We know that Black and brown workers are overly concentrated in underpaid jobs, and many of them live in southern states that don't have a state minimum wage even. So the only way they're going to get a raise to 15 is if the federal government takes action. So that is one of the policies. Unemployment insurance, we saw, was really challenged and stretched in this pandemic. It would have been challenged and stretched even with proper investment in the UI system. But historically, we haven't invested in the technology and the administration of the program. And so when this crush of claims came, there was not really the setup to process them. Some of the computer systems are 25 years old or older. Like, none of us are interacting with any system that handles finances that is 25 years old, right? Most of them are not even 5 years old. And so having the 25-year-old systems trying to, with different sets of rules in different sets of states. So really focusing in on how do we fix the administrative processes for UI so that it is actually customer focused and is getting the money out the door as quickly as possible. And then there's parts of UI that haven't been changed very much since the 1930s when it was created. And it was created with the ideal worker in mind, which at that time was a white male worker working full time. Women weren't in the labor force. It wasn't targeted at folks who are working jobs like gig work or any of the new things that we're seeing. And so it needs to be updated. And the federal government needs to take action to standardize some of the standards. Right now, your benefit is really dependent on where you live. And if you live in a southern state, it's probably less effective for you than if you live in other states. And so really having the government lean in on this unemployment insurance issue. And I could go on, but I'll stop there.
Thank you for that. Mary Kay, I was wondering if I could ask about SEIU's representation of healthcare workers who have been so visible to us and have suffered so much during the coronavirus pandemic. As we think about future organizing strategies in this sector, could you talk about how traditional mechanisms of union power, like collective bargaining, either succeeded or fell short over this past year in addressing their needs?
Yes, thank you, Tammy. I would say where we had 10% of the healthcare workforce in the nation has access to collective bargaining. And it's concentrated right now in the hospital sector, less so in nursing homes, and way less so in the fastest growing job in the economy, which is home care workers. And so, but across, collective bargaining gave workers access to hazard pay, gave workers access to a demand for financing of personal protective equipment and delivery. The March, April of last year, people were scrambling to use the collective bargaining mechanism underneath the president's unwillingness to have a nationally coordinated plan and deal with trying to create some clarity amidst the chaos. So I think the collective bargaining mechanisms helped with safety and health and economic protections. In our best collective bargaining agreements, we were able to get enhanced childcare subsidies for 24/7 workers, like people that are working shifts around the clock. We got temporary housing assistance for healthcare workers in the early stages of the pandemic that did not want to take the virus home to their families because they were concerned about the misuse of personal protective equipment that they were asked to wear much longer than was safe because we were rationing PPE in March and April of last year. So I think that worked. The problem, obviously, is that tens of millions of healthcare workers didn't have access to that mechanism. The federal government was failing them. And as Rebecca just pointed out, some states used their influence to protect workers, and most states aren't inclined to do so. So in California, when the UFCW bargained PPE hazard pay for retail grocery workers, the governor extended it for all grocery workers by order of his emergency powers. And things like that happened around the country. For healthcare workers, what we've tried to do was demand when Virginia home care workers won $10 million more for hazard pay and PPE in April of last year. We tried to scale that in the 16 other states that we represent home care workers in. But again, we represent 800,000 home care workers. There's 2 million women, primarily 90% female workforce, more than majority women of color and undocumented immigrants in this workforce. And so you're right. Collective bargaining in this nation no longer raises standards for all workers like it did when 35% of the American workforce was bargaining. The bargaining, when we have 30% of American workers, set standards for the whole workforce, but unions have been under attack and are now hovering at around 10% of the combined public and private workforce. So our collective bargaining now benefits our members, but doesn't raise standards for others' workers, which is why I agree with Rebecca. We have to have a federal action on the $15 minimum wage because collective bargaining is no longer raising wages for all American workers, and we need government intervention to catalyze wage growth in this country. And so we have to push the bottom up so wages can go up for everybody in the nation.
Thank you. And just a quick follow-up on that, Mary Kay. We have a question from the audience. They want to know what you have identified as bold and innovative strategies to build worker power. So just kind of picking up on that conversation of, perhaps that is, certain innovations within collective bargaining, or maybe that's something completely new. What are you excited about trying out or having, or sort of observing, what the impacts would be?
Well, part of the Fight for 15 in a union movement before the presidential election in 2019 made a demand for unions for all. And it had 4 elements that's really a response to that question. One is that every government policy has to include ways for workers to freely form unions. 2, we have to use government contracting and procurement of government services at the federal level to set wage and benefit standards and to allow workers to form unions. 3, every big investment of government, Green New Deal, Medicare for all, student loan forgiveness has to hardwire in the ability of workers in those sectors to freely form unions. And so right now, what we're the most excited about is the prospect of the next series of actions of government. It taking $3 or $4 trillion of money to invest in creating jobs in caregiving, both childcare and home care jobs, which we think are critical for every American family to get to stability and be able to return to work. Green infrastructure and manufacturing. We want to make sure in home care that the 1.5 million jobs that are contemplated be created are jobs that those women have the power to sit down at a bargaining table at the statewide level and be able to not just raise the wage to 15, but also bargain secure benefits, education and training, and create economic mobility for every family, especially Black and Brown families that have been locked out because that job's been excluded from overtime and Social Security and fair labor standards. We had to hustle in a lot of states just to get home care workers access to unemployment because of the racist exclusion back in the 30s. Those jobs don't have access to a lot of the benefits of the American Rescue Plan unless we write them in. And I think the game changer with the Biden administration, we can write jobs in that have been excluded for far too long.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Rebecca, I wanted to ask you a question from Beth in the audience, who is curious about telecommuting. Obviously, the work from home phenomenon has certainly spread, and I think a lot of workplaces are kind of reconsidering their relationship to a physical space. What do you see as kind of the future of this in terms of workers' rights? And are there particular regulations or laws that will affect telecommuting?
I think that for telecommuting, just like in office jobs, looking at the classification of the worker. So is that worker being misclassified as an independent contractor when they're actually an employee? And that's very important because if they're classified as an independent contractor, then they don't have access to unemployment insurance, workers' compensation, benefits, all of those things, and they have to pay, all of their own taxes. And those jobs are terrific for the folks who are able to bargain and get enough of a wage to cover those things. But when we're talking about workers that are being paid low wages, they're often being exploited. And this status is just being used to save money on the part of the employer. So I think it's going to be really important to make sure that when workers are offered the flexibility to telecommute, that they're not giving up a status that is important for their economic security.
Thank you. Analilia, I wanted to begin with you on a question from Ross Marie in the audience for all of the panelists, which is, what role do you believe affordable childcare has in supporting working families, and what can we do about it? We were obviously very lucky to be visited by your child, so what are your thoughts on this?
Who obviously thinks I'm wrong. So, I mean, the reality is that a lack of affordable childcare keeps women out of the workforce. And therefore, our entire workforce, our entire economy, the workplace suffers because they lack the enrichment that working mothers will bring. Our economy, those individual family economies, as well as community and global economies, are impacted because we're not benefiting from women being able to engage as fully as they'd like. There's a few things that at least from our end, from the Women's Bureau, that we're attuned to and we're trying to engage in. One is democratizing data, making sure that we are capturing and sharing what a childcare costs across the country, making it more accessible not only to women, but also to those on the ground who are advocating for additional resources and support for women workers or working mothers, better yet, or working families, better yet. So one, democratizing that data, making sure that across the board, we have an actual understanding of how much childcare costs, and not just at the state level, trying to make it as granular as possible. That's important to us, and we're working on sharing that kind of data. Two, making sure that the care economy, caring for children, childcare work is both resourced as well as it should be for the workers and the parents. And that it creates a pathway for working women, whether you are the childcare provider or whether you are dependent on it. And so there are many things that we can do. Before we started this session, we were talking about these ideas around creating apprenticeship programs for childcare workers that will create pathways for working women. The fact that their advocates were able to push for additional resources to states that are meant to go to expand childcare opportunities, ensuring that people know that those Block grants have been given to states so that advocates could then push for the full utilization of those dollars. I mean, the reality is that, again, if you are trying to manage caring for young children and engage fully in the workforce, it's really hard to do. Right. And so making sure that we're bridging those gaps for women who need it and want it is of utmost importance if we're actually going to have a fully functioning and fair and equitable economy.
What about you, Rebecca, at NELP, on the role of affordable childcare, perhaps especially with regards to low-wage workers?
Sure. So we're seeing now that Black women are the most likely to drop out of the labor force. So we've seen all of these women that one of our panelists talked about dropped out of the labor force. And it is about not having childcare. And when everything is so tight that this is connected to that, is connected to that, when one thing falls, everything falls. And so it is very important to have affordable childcare so that families can thrive in the economy, all families. So low paid workers, all paid workers. I'll tell you a personal story. When I started at NELP about 11 years ago, I moved to DC with 2 children who were in childcare, and my childcare cost was more than my rent. And I was an attorney, right? So if I wasn't an attorney, how would I have balanced that? So it is just really important that we figure out how we publicly invest in childcare, because, childcare can cost more than college tuition, but there's all kinds of supports that we have put in place as a government around getting people to college. So we need to invest in young people and in families thriving in the same way that we have done in other parts of the economy.
Thank you. And Mary Kay, what about you on the role of affordable childcare in workers' lives? And if there's anything you want to highlight in terms of programs at SEIU, that would also be welcome. And I know you've changed scenery a bit, so thank you for bearing with us.
I hope this doesn't make your audience sick. When I think about the way in which working women, underpaid and undervalued minimum wage working women and working women all across the income spectrum. This has been an undue burden since the beginning of time. And what I'm really excited about is that the Biden-Harris administration, for the first time in our memory, is saying that big government investment in caregiving jobs for childcare providers and for elder care providers and for people that care for people with disabilities in home and community-based services is as important as rebuilding roads and bridges, I think is a historic decision on the part of the administration. And we're going to do our level best to campaign with our members and non-union workers to make sure that intention by the administration becomes law and gets through the House and Senate and signed into law. So I think it'll answer what both Analilia and Rebecca have spoken to, which is that we need to get government investment to catalyze corporate investment as well. One of the first things I did when I started in the labor movement is I was part of Kaiser healthcare workers demanding from their employer 24/7 childcare investment that would make it easier on all of the workers, housekeepers, registered nurses, lab techs, to be able to care for their children and do their job.
with peace of mind. And it was modeled after what the 1199 healthcare workers had won from the New York League of Voluntary Hospitals, which is a child care fund. But the momentum of unions being able to bargain childcare, again, to raise that as an expectation and the standard of all employers, got disrupted by the attack that has been unrelenting on unions' collective bargaining. And I think the federal government catalyzing it and then getting the corporate sector to do their fair share in investment in childcare so we can create a holistic system is another example of how out of the depths of this crisis, we can rewrite the rules for working people in every aspect of their lives, and we can deal with the historic racial and gender inequities once and for all.
Thank you. We have actually a few more childcare questions, which I think is a testament to how central it is, and also the fact that we have three very powerful and amazing women on our panel. But Rebecca, maybe I can start with you on this one, which is, how do we address the tension between affordable childcare on the recipient side and on the worker side? Because obviously we know that childcare workers are at the heart of this provision, and their wages and working conditions are quite poor still. So what do we do about that?
Well, I think that we look at it as having two pieces: raising the standards in childcare and raising the pay for childcare workers, but also figuring out what government investment makes this childcare continue to be affordable. So we can't just say to the childcare teachers, here, we want you to do this, and then now that person leaves that establishment to go make more money. So we have to look at the whole thing holistically and balance and be thinking about unintended consequences of trying to bring up standards or trying to raise wages, making sure that we're balancing that out to make it stay affordable.
Thank you. Analilia, what about you? And if there are any, programs at the Women's Bureau you're exploring in this regard?
I think it's really important. The tension between improving the quality and standards of childcare, butting up against, parents struggling to afford it, is real. And I think that there is a space for government. I think Rebecca kind of, when she said government has a role in making sure that it stays affordable. I mean, the bottom line is, if you have young children and you want to engage in the workforce, you need childcare, right? We benefit from having as many of us in the workforce, right? Our government, our national economy benefits from it. And therefore, there is an obvious role in making sure that gap is bridged. I don't want to get myself in trouble, at least from my perspective and the perspective of the Women's Bureau, exploring ways in which we can do exactly that to alleviate the tension between cost and quality is incredibly important. The last thing I'll say is that, we know that although it is an issue that impacts the family as a whole, it has a disproportionate impact on women. And speaking more about how this is actually a family issue, right? Working dads have skin in the game too. I think is vitally important, because unfortunately, the reality is that some folks may not hear that as important to them, unless they recognize that they actually also have quote unquote skin in the game. So I think both of those things are vitally important.
Thank you. And Mary Kay, on this question of the conditions of childcare workers with regards to affordable childcare. And just before you begin, I just want to encourage the audience to continue submitting questions. Mary Kay?
Yeah, I think what we have to do as a nation is decide that we're going to value women's work once and for all, and we're going to figure out a system that doesn't pit parents against workers, and that requires both government tax policy and corporate investment changing. I think of it every time Jeff Bezos, gives $500 million to some philanthropic event that celebrated, or Dan Gilbert, who we've been struggling to organize security officers with in Detroit, just wiped out the property tax debt of every homeowner in Detroit. And I think how incredible that individual wealthy people get to decide what's most important when we have a government that we elect that helps decide. And if we had a tax policy that could actually invest in childcare and raise wages and create stable jobs, I really think childcare, home care, and service jobs are to this century what auto, steel, and manufacturing were to the last century. And we as a nation have to decide we're going to end poverty wage work in this country, and we're going to not shift the burden to individual parents or to daughters and sons who are trying to make sure their parents are cared for. And so we've seen it by organizing family child care providers that were operating at sub-minimum wage. Our union now represents 100,000 family child care providers. We're trying to imagine how those women get to stair step out of poverty because of the vital role they've played. They've been essential providers during the entire pandemic. And in the states where we represent them, we expanded family child care subsidies for healthcare workers during the pandemic so they had a safe place for their children to learn Zoom through school. So I just think it's, when you look at Quebec, and which our members do all the time because we represent the child care providers in Quebec, parents pay $7 a day for childcare on top of what the government it creates as a subsidy. And those workers have a living wage, stable security, and are able to retire. And so it's just a matter, I think Rebecca said this, it's policy choices that we need to make together as a nation. And I do agree that it isn't just a government role. We have to figure out how to hold corporations accountable for paying their fair share as well.
Thank you. We have a question from Casey in the audience, which is about excluded workers, workers who are not included under traditional labor and employment laws. Casey asks if each of you could talk about your vision for organizing strategy and improving the lives of people in these sectors. And I'll just name a few: domestic workers, agricultural workers, tipped workers in some sense, independent contractors, gig workers. What innovations, what strategies are you excited about? Rebecca, can I start with you, please?
Particularly around the gig work, we're really excited about worker organizing, about the ways in which workers have, engaged. We have workers organizing in cities like Seattle, New York, Philadelphia, and they've won fair pay, paid sick, premium pay for gig workers. And these victories are really critical to the work of organizing and workers coming forward, talking about their experiences. So we're really excited about the ways in which workers are leading their own movement, and they are standing up and saying no more, that this is not acceptable and we are not going to take this anymore. I think from a policy perspective, the PRO Act is a really needed law that would deliver collective bargaining rights to workers who currently are shut out, either by law or by practice. So I think the right to organize is crucial. As Mary Kay has talked about here, it is foundational to workers to having good conditions, to having a safe workplace. We're seeing that in this pandemic. The difference between having a union representing you and not could be life or death in the case of frontline workers. So I think the excitement around what workers are doing for themselves, and we're trying to join and work shoulder to shoulder with them to support their priorities. That part is really exciting, and policies like the PRO Act can help those workers in momentum in terms of what they're doing.
Mary Kay, what about you? Strategies for organizing excluded workers?
SEIU was built as a union of excluded workers, where all of our organizing since our founding in Chicago in 1921, where immigrant flat janitors were not considered real workers by society at the time. And they persevered in organizing and making demand for 10 years before they were finally recognized by the building owners in Chicago, who sat down and voluntarily created a collective bargaining agreement with them, and then they got written into law afterwards. And I think we have to think about excluded workers based on our historical experience, that we are going to use mobilization, protest, and militant action by excluded workers who will get written in by a city, by a state, through a direct voluntary agreement with employers, and then finally by a federal law change, is how I think about it. And we agree with the PRO Act. I think we have to also consider how the investment in the caregiving economy could be a game changer in making a breakthrough on multi-employer bargaining at the state level for home care workers, which could catalyze multi-employer bargaining in other ways. And then one more example that we're trying as part of the Fight for 15 movement is a FAST Recovery Act in California, where because of the infection and death that has occurred for fast food workers in drive-thrus who were not equipped with PPE, not given any health and safety protocols, there's been way too much death of Black and brown workers in fast food. We've made a demand on the California government and legislators support getting an industry table of fast food franchise owners, workers, and government to establish health and safety protocols to stop the infection and death. And I think that will be the kernel of a model that we could scale nationally that gets the fast food employers, McDonald's, Wendy's, and Burger King, to set a national collective bargaining table that's voluntary, that we could then codify by law. And so I think there's multiple interventions on how excluded workers get written in. We are proud to back Uber and Lyft drivers who've been organizing for 3 years in California. It's going to take sustained investment over years to make the breakthrough. And we're proud to support Amazon workers in Bessemer, and the Amazon workers in Minneapolis who won through militant strikes the ability to take prayer 7 times a day as Muslims. And so I just think we need to take hope in the degree to which, while the law may exclude workers, those workers have been included in militant and mobilization actions. And I think we're going to be seeing breakthroughs in the next 4 years, especially with this incredible support of the Biden-Harris administration. If people haven't seen the video that President Biden did speaking to non-union workers about their right to organize, SEIU is using that in every organizing campaign that we're doing right now with, excluded contract workers in the Miami airport who watched it and held firm. And the mayor of Miami canceled the Yulin contract and is now giving the contract to a unionized contractor so that 1,500 workers can get out of poverty and stair step into living wages. There's hundreds of examples like that. And I really think it's us collectively backing the fearlessness and courage of excluded workers. And then it's unions and worker organizations deciding to invest in multi-year organizing campaigns that rewrite the laws and make the breakthroughs to include them.
Thank you, Mary Kay. And Analilia, maybe you could talk about women in the excluded workforce and kind of, I guess, wear both of your hats as an organizer and a representative of the USDOL's.
I mean, it's hard to follow Mary Kay, but it's interesting. As you were asking the question, I was thinking about, I've worked for 2 unions who have followed this same kind of history or had this similar history and model, right? Unite Here, specifically the International Lady Garment Workers Union, when it started organizing, at that time you had craft guilds and mostly men being organized, the tailors being organized, but the young women who were in the factories, unorganized, it was unheard of. It was an innovation to have ready-made clothes. And so people didn't know how to engage that workforce, organize that workforce, protect that workforce. And it took the demands, 20,000 young women taking to the streets. I mention it because yesterday, for example, was the anniversary of the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire. And how does it come about? 20,000 young women take to the streets in 1909. 2 years later, nothing has still changed. And it took not only those women continuing to fight for their rights, a massive tragedy that caught the world's attention, and a pivotal woman, Frances Perkins, witnessing that fire and taking the anger and the ideas on how to protect those workers into government, forming what we understand as the Department of Labor now, informing the New Deal in many ways. What do you see across, whether it was justice for janitors, whether it's the Fight for 15 campaign, you have, as Mary Kay said, workers, and in many instances, young women, women of color, people of color, working mothers, working families, saying, I can't survive. It's untenable. I must take action. And like water, going through and figuring out ways in which they can affect change, what levers they could pull. Maybe it's moving an ordinance at a municipal level, doing enough of those to impact a statewide law, having enough of those statewide laws to then impact federal government. I think we just have to be relentless, and we need to also, maybe I say this self-servingly, but I think that we need to have activism outside, on the streets, at the workplace, and within government in order to affect the change that we know families need. I am one generation removed from factory work. My mom was a lady garment worker. She worked herself into injury, clocking out of one factory into another. I carry that knowledge in the work I do now. And I just think it's really important for us to stay fired up because, and fight like our lives depend on it, because they do. So.
Thank you, Analilia. And thank you for sharing your mom's story as well. We have about 5 minutes left, so I thought we would just do a really rapid exchange where I get to ask each of you one final question. And I'll take these from the audience. Jeff in the audience asks about our policy choices and this struggle that we are in around voting rights, which is obviously affecting who gets a say in our government. Rebecca, could you address this question about, how as labor advocates, should we be intervening in the fight for voting rights for all?
Civic participation is foundational to building power. So we can do our analysis, our research, we can understand where the gaps are, we can be upset about where the gaps are, but if we don't have the power to make the change, we're stuck with it. And so I think this moment where we are in, as Patricia said, chaos and change, we need to use that chaos and change to force open the window for the change that we need. And protecting voter rights is crucial to ever having an equitable and inclusive labor market.
Thank you very much. We have a question from John on the PRO Act, which Rebecca briefly mentioned. Mary Kay, could you talk about what you believe are the most important aspects of that act? Obviously, we're kind of in an uphill battle on it right now, but I know a lot of us are still pushing for it.
Well, I was thinking, Tammy, as you asked Rebecca about voting rights, how inextricably linked the unrigging of the rules for voters is to the unrigging of the rules for workers. And so for SEIU, we've said our vision for working people is that we have to unite millions more people in unions, not just SEIU, but unions as a vehicle for creating a more fair and equitable democracy and economy. And that requires us unrigging the rules. And that's what the PRO Act does in many dimensions. And we think in addition to PRO, where there's enhanced fines for employers who are doing what they're doing in Amazon and which are happening in every organizing campaign, I have to tell you, I was livid that during the height of the pandemic, when there was more death in nursing home than any other workplace in the country, employers were hiring union busters and holding captive audience meetings that enhanced infection of workers. And it just made me realize the degree to which they want to stop unions. And so the PRO Act will correct that behavior. It doesn't eliminate it, which is why worker mobilization and militancy, I think, is a key ingredient of making this change. And then it also unrigs the old rules and writes more people in, as Rebecca said, by creating an ABC test for employees. it deals with the joint employer status that we've been struggling with, where McDonald's won't take responsibility for its franchises when it comes to wages and working conditions, even though they call the shot on the price of the Coke and the potatoes that are bought for the French fries, and every other aspect of McDonald's business is controlled by the multinational corporation, which is why we think the joint employer status issue is so critical. And it would help us break through and create a multi-employer bargaining model, which we think is really essential to increasing workers' power, given the consolidation of power in corporations in this nation. And so I have a lot of hope that if we can stay together in a cross-movement way and think about the intersectionality of the issues that Patricia outlined when she opened as the director of the center, then we can prevail. We can unrig the rules for voters, increase the political power of the majority of this country, and then rewrite the rules for workers to be able to join together in powerful organizations and get a seat at the table to work with employers and government and community to create a better life for everybody in this country.
Thank you. Analilia, let me close out the panel with a question for you from Babette about elder care and kind of sandwich generation concerns, taking care of older people, taking care of younger people. With regards to elder care, how should we support working women who are balancing their jobs while taking care of their parents or other relatives? And how can we also improve the conditions for elder care workers who are predominantly women?
It's funny. It's actually something that's near and dear to me. My father is 94 and ill. My mother is 80, and also starting to experience decline. And then as you all saw, I have 2 young boys. And so I'm constantly trying to figure out how I support my parents, make sure they get to the doctor and take care of their needs while managing my children and having a career. I'm lucky that I have the flexibility to work from home. And so when I need to, I can Zoom in from my parents' home so I could keep an eye on my dad. I'm lucky that I have the kind of compensation that allows me to hire individuals to help me manage that care. But I'm cognizant that that's not the reality for many, many working families, many working women. I think it is important, again, just like we talk about, and Mary Kay mentioned this, we talk about childcare. We need to also be mindful of the stress and cost of elder care and making it both, increasing the standards so that we're providing the kind of care that our children and our parents deserve. As my father always says, may you be so lucky to need this help. But also making sure that we are providing the support and resources, making it affordable and accessible to those who need it and those who offer the care. Right. The reality, again, is that it's mostly women of color. Right. We need to make sure that we are uplifting and providing the resources that support that cohort, because it has a ripple effect across all of our economies. It has a ripple effect on the families of those women who provide care for our elderly relatives. And like Mary Kay said, we have this incredible opportunity to transform our entire economy by improving the quality of those jobs. The last thing I'll say, just because, when you talk about voting rights, for me, I am very clear that, as Mary Kay and Rebecca said, the way in which we actually build an equitable economy is by giving and strengthening the voice of all people, of working class people, of all people. And the easiest, fastest way to shut down that voice is to make it harder to vote and to eliminate people's voice and power at the workplace. That's why the assault, as Mary Kay says, the assault against voting rights and labor rights is connected to essentially just trying to shut down working class people. And so fighting against that behooves all of us who identify in any of those categories, because even if you're not directly having your rights at work curtailed or your rights at the ballot box curtailed, your interests as working class people are being under attack. So thank you for having me. I'm so grateful to Rebecca and to Mary Kay and to you, Tammy and Patricia. I'm so excited to have had this conversation. And I'm glad you got to meet my son, August.
Well, thank you so much to August and Analilia, Rebecca, and Mary Kay for their generous participation this morning. I'm really honored and excited to be thinking about your calls to action. We're now going to take a short break, and if you would stick around, you will have the opportunity to watch a short video to learn about the incredible life of Lois Gray, who we're celebrating today. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.